now that we've jumped into gravimetric stoichiometry and we have a bit of a base for that, we can now jump into this concept of what's called limiting reagents. So the questions that you've been doing so far to this point is really under the assumption that you have, so one of the reactants potentially is given a finite mass, but the other reactant that it's reacting with is considered to be an excess. In other words, you have an unlimited supply to make sure that the mass of this substance that you're given over here completely reacts, that all of it is used up, so that you can find out how much of the product is being made. Or vice versa, you can do stoichiometry the other way too. But for these types of questions here, what we have is we have a finite mass for both of our reactants. And so the question here is asking, and again in the black is what would be given to you in the question, it's asking for you to find the maximum mass of strontium sulfate given these two masses for these two reactants. And so you got to find out, first and foremost, what substance is going to limit the reaction from carrying on. In other words, I've got these two reactants, one of these guys is going to run out first. And which one is it? And what is the mass of the strontium sulfate that I'm going to have when that happens? And so that's what this question is asking for you to figure out when it says find the maximum mass of strontium sulfate. So I've got 110 grams of copper 2 sulfate and 125 grams of strontium nitrate. And the first thing that kids will look at it is they'll say, okay, well, hey, this question's easy. This one has more mass than this one, and so obviously I'm going to run out of this one first. So this is my limiting reagent. And turns out that that's not always the case in how it kind of works out. So I've given you an example to kind of illustrate this so that you can see that that is true in only some cases and not true in others. And this is one of those not true circumstances. The way that we need to solve this instead of just looking at the masses and saying, hey, that's the limiting reagent, is we need to do the stoichiometry for this. So you can see I've done the gravimetric stoichiometry here where I've done the calculations. I've got a balanced chemical reaction. I've done steps 2, 3, and 4. But you can see I've done the stoichiometry for both substances as kind of labeled as given number 1 and given number 2. So the way that I'm doing this stoichiometry is like this. What I'm doing is I'm taking this 110 grams of copper 2 sulfate first, for example, and I'm going to do the stoichiometry assuming that I have an unlimited supply of strontium nitrate. Now, I know the question doesn't tell me that I have an unlimited supply. It tells me I do have a limited supply of 125 grams. But for the purposes of figuring out the question, this is what we're going to assume. So I do the stoichiometry, and what this means is when I do stoichiometry, I am calculating how much is being produced if all 110 grams of copper 2 sulfate is going to react. The only way to ensure that is to react it with excess strontium nitrate. So I do the stoichiometry with that assumption. All 110 grams of copper 2 sulfate reacts. You can see I've done the math here, and it punches out as 127 grams of strontium sulfate that can be produced. So that's the maximum amount of copper 2 sulfate that can make the strontium sulfate 127 grams. That's the maximum it can make from the 110 grams of copper 2 sulfate. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to reverse the roles. So now I'm going to say, okay, that's how much 110 grams of copper 2 sulfate can make. How much can 125 grams of strontium nitrate make? And so again, if I do the stoichiometry for this, I'm assuming that I have an unlimited supply of copper 2 sulfate. And so I do the stoich, 125 grams of copper 2 sulfate. You can see I've done the math there. And the number punches out as 108 grams of strontium sulfate. So here's another very common mistake that kids will make at this point of the question. They'll say, okay, the question says find the maximum mass of strontium sulfate. And they think maximum means larger. And so then they go ahead and they say, okay, well, 127 grams is the maximum that can be made. And so copper 2 sulfate is my limiting reagent. Done. I'm finished. Turns out they'd be wrong. Because what we now have to consider is that I'm no longer reacting both of these in excess amounts, I have a limited supply for both. And so what we have to look at is we have to say, okay, the maximum amount that can be produced is the smaller number. And it's because once I produce 108 grams of strontium sulfate, I am going to run out of the strontium nitrate. At that point, all 125 grams of this has reacted. Conversely, if I look at this, not all of the 110 grams of copper 2 sulfate has reacted when I get to the 108 gram level, because this 110 grams can make 127 grams of strontium sulfate. So if I have these two limitations where I have 110 grams reacting with 127 or 125 grams, what I'm now saying is that once I reach the 108 gram level of the strontium sulfate being produced, I am out of strontium nitrate. And once all of this is gone, this reaction stops happening. And so the rest of the 110 grams that will have reacted here, the rest of it won't be able to react. And so my limiting reagent for this reaction is going to be, in fact, the strontium nitrate. This is my limiting reagent, and this is my excess reagent, copper sulfate. And you can see here for this one that my limiting reagent is the one that even though it has a higher or a larger mass, is still the one that is going to limit this reaction. If I had more strontium nitrate, I could produce more strontium sulfate because I would still have some copper 2 sulfate left over. And the reason that this is because if you look at the calculation here, you can see that reactions in chemistry take place in amounts or moles, right? And that's what we've always established. And so using masses is not a good way of determining limiting and excess reagents, because yeah, I might have a mass of this substance here and I have a mass of this substance here, but these substances have different molar masses, which is going to change how many moles of each of those substances I'm going to have. And if this is reacting at a 1-to-1 ratio, then the amount of moles that I'm going to have is going to be the thing that's going to dictate how much is made. So just to recap, with questions like this, you'll be asked for limiting reagents, either find the maximum mass of some substance that's produced, and when you do that, you got to make sure that you are looking for the number that's the smallest. This is the maximum mass that can be produced of strontium sulfate, because once I get to that number, this substance has run out and the reaction will stop, and I won't be able to complete the rest of what this reaction could do simply because this guy's all gone. Another type of question that you could be asked is simply to identify what is the limiting reagent. So again, doing these steps here and these two stoichiometry questions, you can identify, okay, hey, strontium nitrate is my limiting reagent. So you may see questions like that as well. And that's essentially what you guys need to know as it relates to limiting reagents. Thanks for watching. Good luck in the practice.